Hello friends, and welcome to Enchanted Rose Costumes. Today's video, I'm going to try and recreate this beautiful pair of transitional Regency stays from the V&A. I remember when I first came across these stays, probably around 6 or 7 years ago, and it was love at first sight. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew one day I would be making these stays for myself. And since I am diving into the wonderful world of Regency undergarments, I decided to jump in feet first and see what I can create. So let's get started. First things first, I like to mark out my shape and seam lines while draping a project, as I find it makes it much easier to create the shape I want. Usually I'd use a 1/4 inch black twill tape, but I don't have any on hand at the moment, so I used what I had in my stash. I have used draping tape in the past, but it isn't reusable and twill tape and pins are. Once I have my general shape in place, I grab my mock-up fabric and go to town. I always try to have the straight of grain marked on my fabric while draping, as it makes life much easier later on. Of course, in this case, I literally cut it away. Go figure. Once I have a shape I like, I trim away the majority of the extra fabric and then draw out the shape of the pattern with a marker. I also mark the center front and waistline to make it easier to line up the pieces later on. And then I continue this process until I have the pattern I want. As much as I love draping, the downside of it is how much fabric is wasted during mock-ups. For the pieces that are large enough, I do try and reuse them, but for the smaller bits, they usually end up as cabbage stuffing in other projects. Next, I transfer the draped pattern to paper and clean up all the seams. I also transfer all important marks such as balance points to make sure everything lines up again. So I think I'm happy with this cup shape. I think I've done like 5 or 6 mock-ups for changing the pattern just to see what worked. Once I actually sew this up correctly, this technically should be adjustable, which is great if you change bust sizes. So going over here, these are some of my mock-ups. Just like there's slightly different changes. So this is the one that is over there. This actually was my first kind of draft. That's how I envisioned it going together, and then when I did my mock-up of it, I realized it was not working. And you can see just how different those are. So I just slowly evolved the cup shape until I arrived at this one. With my pattern mostly complete, it was time for a real mock-up to test the fit on my body. I just finished my fitting. There's a couple adjustments that I have to make that will definitely make it a lot more comfortable, but for the most part, the fit is almost perfect. I'm pretty happy with it, and I think as soon as I make those adjustments, I will be ready to cut out the fabric.
The fabric I chose for my stays are as followed. The fashion layer is a printed white on white cotton. The second layer is a plain white quilting cotton. The third and strength layer I opted for my usual coutil, and lastly the lining layer is a light linen. The materials listed for the original stays is cotton with silk embroidery and lined with linen. And while I don't know how that pair was constructed or how many layers it actually has, I cross-referenced it to the 1790 stays from Patterns of Fashion 5, and that shows 4 layers of fabric being used, so I decided it'd be fine to use that many layers on mine. After cutting out my fabric, I pinned together the first 3 layers for each piece. And then I flatlined the machine edges just inside the seam allowance. Once all the pieces were flatlined, I then added my boning and cording channels to the back side of the coutil using a friction pen. For the center front and center back pieces, I added a 1 1/4 inch facing so I would have a nice clean finish on the inside. And with everything marked, it was time to start sewing the boning channels. With all the channels done, I moved on to cutting the bones. I actually kind of went the cheaper route with boning this time, and I used a heavy-duty zip tie from the hardware store, and I was actually pleasantly surprised. While I wouldn't use them on a regular corset, they worked quite well for these stays. And if I was in a pinch, I would probably use them again. And now comes the point I was slightly worried about. I've only ever corded a corset with the method I showed in my 1890s corset video, but with this pattern I had to try cording after sewing the channels. After watching Noelle's video on her Regency corset, I went straight to the fabric store to buy myself the longest needles I could find. I ended up getting a 4-pack of the Dritz long upholstery needles, and they worked perfectly. Now, because my cord is also on the thinner side, I did double it up in the cording channels, and it worked out just great. And to help coax the thread back together again after inserting the cord, I used the point of my awl, which did a bang-up job. If you're going to try this for yourself, I do recommend getting a good set of pliers because you will have a heck of a time trying to pull a needle through with just your fingers. Along the waistline, I needed to insert the bones first and then sew the cording channels. Now looking closely at the original stays, it looks like there's just 1 row of cording at the bottom, but I decided to add 2 to mine because I think it looks pretty. And finally, after finishing all the boning and cording, it was time to actually put the pieces together. Now historically, these would have been sewn together edge to edge after the seam allowances had been basted down, but since I'm working on a deadline, I opted for machine sewing this time around. After sewing all the pieces together, I marked my eyelets along the back. The original pair are actually spiral laced, but I decided to change this up so I could add fan lacing to my pair. And while fan lacing wouldn't have technically been used at this point in time, I really wanted to give it a try because it's so darn pretty. Are you starting to see a theme here? Now, when I first started historical sewing, hand-sewn eyelets were the bane of my existence. But now that I've done them enough times, I actually find them quite enjoyable. It's funny how things change like that. I've got about 16 of these to finish up, so while I do that, I'm going to let sponsor Marika introduce you to today's sponsor.
Thank you, Sewing Marika. Today's video is kindly sponsored by Acorn TV. If you haven't heard of Acorn TV, they are a streaming network with a delightful library of timeless classics and newly discovered films and series from Britain, Australia, Ireland, and beyond. I've had a look through a few of the categories in their library, and there are several shows that I'm very excited to watch. I tend to watch a lot of shows when I'm doing my hand sewing, so I decided to turn on the documentary The Big House Reborn while working on my eyelets. This show follows the restoration project of the 200-year-old Mount Stuart house in Northern Ireland. This fascinating docuseries follows a 3-year project to restore the house to its original glory. Now, if documentaries aren't quite your cup of tea, don't you worry, there is a wide variety of mysteries, dramas, and comedies. And if you're in the mood for a quirky British comedy, the other one is a must-see. The series follows two sisters who are from very different worlds, and they don't actually know that the other one exists until their dad dies. Also, if you're a fan of Downton Abbey, you'll recognize Siobhan Finneran, who plays the mother of one of the sisters. Acorn TV is easy to stream to your preferred device, and you can watch all the premium content ad-free for just $5.99 a month. Escape to Britain and beyond without leaving your seat. Try Acorn TV free for 30 days by going to acorn.tv and using the code ENCHANTEDROSE. Back to you, Sewing Marika.
With my eyelets complete, it is time for one of my least favorite tasks, binding. I cut my bias binding strips 1 1/4 inches wide and decided to try Redthreaded's binding method. I have tried binding my stays with machine in the past, and let's just say that it was not as successful as I'd hoped it would be. But following Cynthia's method, I was pleasantly surprised this time around. Before binding the bottom of the stays, I wanted to insert the bust cups so I could do a quick fitting to see if I needed to tweak the fit at all before finishing off the bottom. The bust cups are cut from the printed and the quilting cotton fabric and stitched together with the right sides facing each other. After stitching that up, I then flipped it right side out and gave it a quick press, and then added my drawstring stitching guide to the inside of the cups. After stitching all the channels, I then fed a cord through the channel, making sure to leave a loop at the center of each cup on the inside so I could tighten it. I then secured the ends of the drawstring and then added 2 rows of gathering along the bottom of the cup. And then I gathered it up and inserted it into the stays. Now, after looking at several different pairs of stays from this time, I decided to insert them by pinning the seam allowance to the inside of the stays and then stitching them in place along the edge of the binding to hide the stitching as best I could. Well, I don't know if this is actually historically correct. This is how I interpreted it from looking at the original pair. In sewing it this way, I don't have to worry about the excess fabric from the seam allowance underneath the bust cup, and the raw edges are hidden by adding the lining. And finally, it is time to stitch the bottom binding. After finishing all the binding, I then cut out my linen lining and whipped everything in place. And with the lining in, I then quickly added some eyelets to the straps. And now it is time for some fan lacing. I came across a late Regency corset from LACMA, which I will link down below, that has fan lacing, and I really wanted to try it out. There are modern sliders that you can find online that makes fan lacing adjustable, but this method works too. Essentially, I just cut different lengths of ribbon and crossed them over each other and then pinned them all to the same spot on the corset. I then copied the shape of the lacing holder from the 1820s corset and added it to mine. Now I don't actually know if that's the name of it, I'm just calling it that because that's what makes sense to me. One thing that is unfortunate is that I cut my ribbons on the shorter side. Looking back now, ideally the ribbon should have come more around to the front to make it easier to get the stays off and on. And I wasn't really thinking about that at the time, so oops. After finishing the lacing, I decided I needed to add a paint stick, I mean busk, down the center front, as it needed a little more stability. I marked my length and then cut off and rounded the edges for a nice finish. I then sewed up a little pouch for the busk to sit in and whipped it to the inside of the stays. And for the final element, I added some thread chain anchors for the mostly decorative center front ribbon to weave through. I say mostly because the ribbon actually helps keep the busk in place on the inside. They're done! So I am so happy with how these turned out. I'm not gonna lie though, when I was trying to figure out the bust cup situation, my brain was not happy. But now that they are done, and I think that they look fairly close to the originals, I am very happy that I worked through it because, oh my goodness, there was a moment there when I was ready to just scrap the bust cups and just redo the front and just put in gores because my brain was not happy. It was not a good moment. I seriously think my favorite thing about this is the fan lacing because just look at that. It's just beautiful. Oh my goodness. Oh, and it's so easy. It makes lacing up so much easier. I definitely would like to try fan lacing in other corsets in the future because that was fun. I really had fun with that. When you put it on and just everything cinches in at the same time, it feels so good. Now, for anyone who's interested in kind of making a pair like these, I'm thinking of possibly releasing the pattern on my Patreon.
I'm not making any promises because I've never released a pattern before. I don't even know how to transfer the pattern onto the computer so it'd be printable. So if you are interested, just let me know down in the comments and I will do my best to try and make that happen. I'm not making any promises because I'm not tech savvy at all. Like, I kill technology a lot. Just ask my husband. Now, I am just going to say that I've never done this before, so I have no idea the logistics of how to put a pattern onto the internet. I could scan it, but I really don't know about the whole sizing thing, so I'd have to figure that side of it out. Just as a disclaimer though, it probably won't happen until like after the new year because I've got a lot of stuff on my plate right now, and it will only be in one size because I don't know how to do the whole grading stuff with patterns. I'm just a one-woman show. Let me know in the comments. Thoughts, things, Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you want to, feel free to leave a comment down below of the project you're working on. Up next for me is more lace and a pretty petticoat. But first I need to clean up a little bit because it's kind of a mess in here. It's really bad. Oh my goodness. Alright, see you next time. Bye! I'll be trying to recreate this beautiful oh my goodness. I'm so happy with how these turned out. I think they're absolutely gorgeous. Oh. Oh, I almost got you. I hate flies. Why do you keep coming back to this room? Why? You have the entire house out there to go annoy someone else. Thank you.